We are joined by Garrick Professor of Law, political commentator and Spectator columnist, the man who needs no introduction, James Allen. James, welcome to Spectator TV.
Nice to be back again, Alexandra. How's it down there in Sydney?
Looking a little bit wintry, I must say. I got drowned the other day coming across the bridge, so I think our seasons has absolutely switched over and no global boiling anywhere in sight. But James, we are going to do something a little bit different today. We're shifting from passive political commentary into political activism. Now, I know, shock horror, the Conservatives are picking up their pitchforks and we're heading it out into the public square to go and talk to people. Now, specifically, there were rallies across Australia's capital cities last weekend to protest the digital ID bill. James, what is it about this particular topic that persuaded you to address the huge crowds in Brisbane?
Well, I think lockdown must have changed a lot of people's minds. I mean, I was always moderately skeptical of government, but they were shocking. And I mean, the gist of the ID bill is that you're supposed to trust government. You're going to trust them to keep your information private. You're going to trust them the next pandemic not to utilize everything they know about you to, enforce a mandate of some sort. And I don't really have any trust in them. As Jay Bhattacharya said, the world-leading Stanford epidemiologists, the biggest source of disinformation through 2.5 years were governments. And we know from the lockdown files in the Telegraph that it wasn't just misinformation, which is, being wrong. They were deliberately lying sometimes. So that's disinformation. So they hit the duo. And so I really don't trust governments at all. And, let's be honest, the Liberal Party was woeful. And so you can't, they have liberal in their name, but as far as I can tell, there's not a lot of concern with free speech. So really, the best thing is to try to stop these things before they get started. So I'm perfectly happy to deal with completely incompetent government services. I don't think this bill will make those any better, but it'll just give government access to too much about you. And sure, if you lived in a perfect world, Sweden in the 1950s, where everyone knew everybody else, maybe, you could have some trust in the government. But looking at what we just lived through, the massive transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich, and worse, from the young to the old, and, kids who lost a year and a half of school will never make it up. Poor kids are, their lives are blighted. And the kind of people who did well, rich people living at home, civil servants, the politicians who never took a pay cut, want us to trust them. You've got to be kidding me. I don't.
Well, governments have to earn trust, and they have done absolutely nothing recently to assure us that they are actually trustworthy. But, people were all up there laughing at your jokes at the rally, and you had a gorgeous day, and it was a huge turnout. But I hear people saying to me, well, what's the point? It's already on its way, this legislation. Why the protest? And mind you, they never say these sort of things to the left when they go out and protest. The left are encouraged to protest everything and anything as a way of life. But it's almost like Conservatives are discouraging each other because they're embarrassed somehow to be openly political. Is there a point to protesting things like the digital ID? I mean, is there value in citizens coming out to show that they are not happy with what politicians are doing and that there is no social license for things like this bill?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we're trying to put some backbone in the Liberal Party. And when I say Liberal Party, I mean the 24-year-old advisors that seem to run all the policy decisions after they've heard the focus group of 4 people they picked from an inner-city Teal seat. So once they've heard the focus group from the inner-city Teal seat and it's been filtered through the 24-year-old chief advisor, at some point, the protests are aiming to put a little bit of backbone into the Liberal Party on free speech. And as I said at the rally, if the Liberals came out and said, we will repeal this, that makes the cost a lot higher for Labour. And the really only way to do that is for the 8, 10, 12% of the population who care about these freedom issues, maybe 10, 12%, to make it clear that as atrociously bad as Labour is, if the Libs don't start listening to freedom issues, we will preference Labour. Again, I get so many people who say to me, we have a very unique voting system in this country. It's preferential voting, and no one else has it, except for Nauru or something. There's 2 countries. And, people say to me, well, Jim, I didn't vote for the Libs. And I say, well, where did you preference them? I put them 4th. I said, where did you put Labour? Fifth. So you voted for the Libs. It's a protection racket for the two main parties. First past the post is infinitely better. If we could move to optional preferential, it would be better. And it would be better because you could send a message to your side of politics and say, you have been so shockingly bad, we're going to do something about it. So in Canada, the Brian Mulroney Tories back in the 1980s had a massive majority. I think there were 170 out of 250 odd seats in the Canadian House of Commons. And at the next election, they had 2. Now, you can't do that in preferential voting. And I say 2, I mean the number under 3 and above 1. They had 2 seats. They lost even official opposition status. And that's because they lost about 20% of their base core vote, because people could just go in and tick Monster Raving Loony Party or some third party. That's what you can do in first past the post. We are forced to choose between the two main parties, which is why they will never change it. And so if you want to send a message, unless the Libs start caring about freedom issues, you can just say, look, I'm putting Greens last. They always should go last. Libs second last and Labour third last. Even though that's a vote for Labour, the threat of that might actually induce the Liberals to actually start taking some of these concerns seriously. I mean, for God's sakes, the Liberals are the ones who are coming up with the ACMA bill. How is Fletcher even he should be thrown out of the party room for coming up with that idea.
Yeah,
it is shocking.
Fletcher's at the bottom of a lot of bad ideas in the Liberal Party that they are currently stuck with. But
you shouldn't be allowed, you shouldn't be allowed near any policy making at all.
But you're totally right about this idea of making noise for the Liberals to hear, because particularly in this age where the Liberals have no moral fortitude or spine of their own, they are taking their policy directions from the noise they see on social media and in the streets. So they think something's popular, they are far more likely to run with it. Look how long it took them to get on board with against the voice to Parliament. They only did that when they were sure that there were enough people saying no, that it was safe for them to get on board. So we do need to make them aware of what might be popular for Conservatives so they can then pick that up. But another thing that I've heard muttered on social media is that political parties can do whatever they like once they've been elected, and that the act of being elected somehow grants them a mandate to enact whatever policies that take their fancy, even if they never advertised those policies to the electorate. Is that true, or do political parties have some responsibility to effectively bring in policies they promised and not just go completely off into a different reality?
Well, it's certainly what you've just described certainly describes the Albanese government. They are doing things they did in no way signal they were going to do. And in a democracy, the remedy is to vote them out. The problem is that the careerist politicians have made the calculation that voters, if you come in, say you're not going to do anything, and then do it, the voters are going to forget because they're too stupid. So it's at the end of the day, you get the politicians you deserve. Australians were overwhelmingly sheep-like and cowardly and pusillanimous during the lockdowns, and they sort of got the politicians they deserve. Now, I feel that things are getting a bit more optimistic, and I think there are exceptions. So basically, the sort of old sort of idea, I won't call it a social contract, but the idea was if you were going to do something novel, bring in a GST or something, you signaled that to the electorate before the election, and then you had a mandate. And again, we're one of the very few countries in the world with a strong upper house. Australians think it's normal to have a Senate which has, very Spartan, thin democratic credentials compared to the lower house. The lower house, every constituency has the same number of voters, more or less. In the upper house, if you're from Tasmania, your vote is worth about 15 times what it is in New South Wales. And so you win an election, which means winning the lower house, and then you have to go and bargain with some sort of person from Tasmania who's got a extended family and 15 extra friends, and they've won one of the 12 Senate seats from Tasmania. And so at least what a mandate did was it sent a message to these senators that we campaigned on this and you have to pass it. Again, the problem is the senators don't care. They don't pass it anyway. And so then your only tool is a double dissolution election, which I would use more frequently. I would signal we're going to do this. And I would do what Whitlam did. I wouldn't go to a double dissolution election with one policy. I would rack up 5. We're going to repeal Section 18C. We're going to do all of these things. make it our, we're going to cut the budget of the ABC in half. We're going to, list them all, try to pass them, have them blocked in the Senate, and then say, okay, conservatives and everybody else, here's your one chance. We're going to deliver you 7 policies. This is going to be great. Let's go and have a double dissolution. Well, that requires courage. And you said, we don't have a party with a moral fiber and a backbone. We're aspiring to a liberal party that's merely an invertebrate. Right now, they're insects. We're hoping they evolve into jellyfish so that at some point they can then evolve into having a backbone. So
if it was me running the party, my banner, if I was a conservative, would be set Australia free, and just have what you said, which is a whole raft of policies that are about restoring freedom and indeed restoring the sanity of what used to be common sense in our country, which is sadly lacking right now. But I don't know if it was the general vibe of the rain that we had down in Sydney, that although all of our attendees at the rally were enthusiastic about the rally itself, when you talked to them and when you moved through the crowd, there was a sense of despair that they had no way to stop policies like the digital ID, like the misinformation and disinformation bill, from being pushed through on this Labor-Liberal unity ticket. And in a side note, I was talking to Neil Oliver from the UK about when it is valid for society to disobey bad laws and the idea of civil disobedience. Do you think that we are heading towards a state in Australia where we've got tyrannical laws and things get so bad that we might reopen the discussion on civil disobedience? Or is that not a function in Australian politics?
Well, I mean, if ever there was a time to do it, it was during lockdowns. And again, let's remind viewers that governments and the sort of credentialed class overwhelmingly got everything wrong. They said it didn't come out of the Wuhan lab, and it overwhelmingly, the evidence now is it did. And that was pretty obvious early on. We knew early on that it was 1,000 to 10,000 times more dangerous for over 70s than it was under 30s. So, these politicians got up and said, we're all in this together. Lie. They got it so badly wrong that Sweden, which didn't lock down, has the lowest cumulative excess deaths. And the response to that is, oh, yeah, but Sweden had more COVID deaths. But deaths are deaths, If your policy leads to a death, and anyway, you can game COVID deaths because dying with and dying because of, easy to manipulate. They got masking wrong. They got the vaccines wrong. They swore up and down they didn't stop you catching it or transmitting it. That was pretty early wrong. And so there's so many things they got wrong. And that really didn't lead to very much civil disobedience. I mean, I'm lucky I was in Queensland. Not really much happened here. It wasn't thuggish and authoritarian the way it was in Victoria. I would have been out on the streets in Victoria, right? There's a time to, civil disobedience is the idea where you knowingly break the law and take the punishment, like go to prison, right? So if you're if you're hiding the fact you're breaking the law, that's not civil disobedience. And the Liberal Party, the problem was the Liberal Party was out there, passing motions to censure George Christensen because he said, masks don't work. And he said the vaccine mandate's not going to work. And he said lockdowns don't work. And his own party, these supposed liberals, they didn't say, look, we disagree with you, George. They censured him. These are the James Pattersons of the world and the Tim Wilsons who came into Parliament, peacock-like displaying their commitment to freedom, completely gone. So the pessimistic side is, well, if we didn't get too much civil disobedience during lockdowns, we're probably not going to get it now. But on the other hand, you can punish, you can make it plain to the liberals. They live off preference flows. Now, they need to get into the 40s, and I was pretty confident that Dutton was going to win because I thought, look, people wouldn't preference Morrison. I wouldn't preference Morrison. He was a disgrace of a prime minister, in my view. But I was prepared. I thought a lot of people in the Freedom Wing were prepared to preference Dutton. But, what is he doing on these free speech issues? Why is he trying to censor true information of these? And so, to some extent, he's throwing away the preference flows, and he's going to go back to the Morrison-type preference flows. Well, we can accentuate that. We can make it clear to these 24-year-old advisors from the teal seats who, have never had a real job in their lives and for some reason have incredible sway over the Liberal Party, that this isn't good enough. And You can lose an election because of preference flows.
Yeah, well, that was actually the takeaway from our wonderful rallies, James, that that whole freedom of speech thing, the misinformation, disinformation bill, that is a hard line for conservatives and libertarians. So if Dutton's not careful, you're right, that's the end of their preference flows. But that's all we have time for here today. Thank you for joining us on Spectator TV.
Thank you, Alexandra.